Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring two stories that took place in the Appalachian Mountains many years ago, and are now being told by the descendants of the people who lived through them. I really enjoy this format, where instead of reading stories written as if they happened to me personally, I'm sharing accounts of events that happened to someone more distant in the past. Maybe it's just a personal preference, or maybe it's simply because it's different from what we usually do. Either way, let me know what you think. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I've grown up hearing stories about the Appalachian Mountains. They were always there in the background of my life, like the sound of the wind or the smell of the cold when winter sets in. And ever since I was a kid, I remember my grandpa talking about West Virginia, where the roads wind around the mountains, and folks learn early that news travels slowly, but stories live forever. Most of the stories he told me didn't even start with him. They came from his mother, my great-grandmother. And I still remember her, even though I was very young when she passed. She didn't talk much, but when she did, everyone got quiet without even meaning to. She didn't say the mountains were magical or cursed or anything like that. She just spoke about them like they were watching, like they noticed things. And because of that, I always thought the stories were just part of the place, something you inherited along with the land and the silence. These days, we don't live in those mountains anymore. My grandfather eventually left them behind, not just because of the sadness, but also because the poverty was overwhelming. Still, I visited a few times when I was a kid. And even though my grandfather left that place, those mountains never really left him. And because of that, I feel like I inherited a little of it too. I don't live there, but sometimes it feels like I do. It's a strange kind of nostalgia, like missing a limb you never actually had. Like I was saying, on the days when my grandfather felt more melancholic or just bored, he'd sit down and start telling these stories. Then there was this one story my grandpa told me that was different. And the way he spoke when he told it, slower, more careful, always made me feel like we'd crossed some kind of line from stories into memory. He said it happened more than 50 years ago. Back then, he was young, and he lived in a small mountain community where people kept to themselves. And like most small places, everybody knew each other. Which meant that when he started to care for a girl in the town, he kept it to himself. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He barely even admitted it to himself. He said he'd always been quiet and shy, and the fear of being laughed at or just turned down was enough to keep his feelings buried. But still, the feeling was there. And even if nobody else noticed, he knew he looked out for her more than he did for anyone else. And then, one day, completely out of nowhere, he found a letter at his door with her name signed at the bottom. The letter said she felt the same way. It said she liked him, but that she was afraid of her father finding out. So she wanted to meet him in secret, deep in the woods, at a place he already knew. That way they could talk in private and maybe even plan a future together. And right there, he said, was the first strange thing. Because back then, especially in that part of the world, she almost certainly couldn't read or write. Women didn't get much schooling, especially poor ones. But he didn't think about that at the time. All he saw was a door opening where he thought there wasn't one. And when you've spent your life being quiet and careful, and then suddenly something feels possible, you don't always question it. So he went. He told me that from the moment he stepped into the trees, something felt wrong. Just in that slow, creeping way that makes you realize you're farther from home than you meant to be. For the first time since receiving the letter, he stopped thinking with his heart and started thinking rationally. And for the first time, he was beginning to question things. But because he'd already decided to go, he kept walking. Step after step, deeper and deeper into a part of the woods where people usually didn't wander. Especially not young women alone. And as he walked, he noticed little things. A sound here, a shift there. Nothing clear. Nothing he could grab onto. Just enough to make him feel watched without knowing why. And then, the next thing he remembered was being hit hard in the head. There wasn't really a moment to describe. Just being there, and then not being there. Everything was dark. When he finally woke up, he realized he was lying on the ground inside a cave. One of the many old caves scattered around that region. His head was pounding. He couldn't think straight. And when he finally focused enough to understand where he was, he saw his friend leaning over him, shaking him, trying to wake him up. His friend told him he didn't have time to explain anything. He just kept saying one thing. They had to leave before the people who brought him there came back. Because if they did, he wouldn't be leaving at all. And that was when my grandpa realized something he'd only ever heard whispered about. Because in those hills, way back then, there were always rumors. People who lived by their own rules. Far away from everyone else. And who sometimes did things no one wanted to look too closely at. He had heard about them. Everyone had. But those were always other people's problems. Other people's stories. This time, it was him. And because his head was foggy, and his legs barely worked, and fear does strange things to people, he didn't argue. He didn't plan. He didn't even think. He just ran for his life. And the whole time, he didn't look back. Not once. He just kept going until the trees finally thinned out and the world started to look like home again. Somehow, and he never really knew how, he made it back. He hadn't planned to run toward the village. He had only planned to run. But it was as if his body knew that was the right direction, and for that, he was grateful. That is, until he looked back and realized he was alone. He waited for more than half an hour until his own breathing calmed, but Caleb never came back. After that night, his friend was simply gone. People said he was missing. They talked quietly, then they stopped. And because it was a remote place, and because the police rarely came out that far unless they absolutely had to, nothing much happened. The only family Caleb had was his father, who in reality spent most of his time drunk and too preoccupied to even notice that his son was no longer there. Life went on, at least on the surface. But inside, my grandpa never moved past it, because he kept replaying just one thing. He had never turned around. He had never checked. He had just run. And he never saw his friend again. And the worst part was not knowing. Not knowing whether his friend had been taken too, or whether he had been part of it all along and changed his mind at the last minute. There were no answers, just silence. He told me that was the single greatest regret of his life, that he had been so scared he hadn't even thought to look back. After that, he almost never went into the woods again. And when he did, he was never alone. As for the girl, she never knew anything about it. She couldn't have written the letter. She married a few years later and built a life of her own. My grandpa never married her. He eventually had a child, my father, but that was different. He said a part of him had been left behind in those hills. And through all of this, the stories continued. They always did. He used to say that ever since he was a small boy, he remembered his mother talking about the mountains and the people who lived in them, about how things happened out there that never made it into any newspaper. And when I was little, listening to him felt like being connected to something older than both of us. Some stories he heard, some stories he imagined. But this one, I truly believe he lived it, even if some details may have been forgotten or slightly altered over time. I believe the core of it really happened. And now, whenever winter comes and the nights stretch long and quiet, I still think about him, and about those mountains, and about how many stories they've kept hidden, long before us, and long after we're gone. When I tell this story, I always start by saying that it happened more than 45 years ago. Back when the winters in the Appalachian Mountains felt colder, and the silence carried heavier things than just snow. It's the kind of story that never really settles. It sits inside a family for decades, slowly pulling threads loose until everyone is left with their own version of what they think happened. And none of those versions bring peace. And so, this is not my story. It belonged first to my mother, and before that, it belonged to my aunt. The woman who went into those mountains looking for her niece and came back different. My cousin was never found. My aunt never really came back from that place either. And my mother's side of the family, well, the truth is that nothing was ever truly whole again. That happiness that had always seemed to surround the three sisters just disappeared. I'm telling it now because recently, for a brief and painful moment, we thought she might have been found in Canada. Or rather, we thought someone had found a woman who could have been her. It turned out not to be true, but the hope rose up. And then the truth crushed it back down again. And all of the old memories came rising with it. So this is what happened, as my mother told it. Back then, there was no technology like today. No constant contact, no location sharing, nothing like that. My cousin had gone up into the Appalachian Mountains to stay in a cabin for a few weeks while she worked on a horror story for her college dissertation. A lot of people knew she'd be there. Professors, friends, relatives. And maybe that never meant anything. Or maybe it meant everything. No one ever figured that part out. The only thing we know is that there were several male classmates who were jealous that my cousin, a woman, had received the scholarship they wanted. And every single one of them knew exactly where she was going to be. Maybe it was her innocence, her belief that not everyone is cruel or jealous, that led her to her end. She hadn't given any sign of life for over 5 days. Normally she wrote letters, or at least called from a payphone in town. But this time, nothing. Her mother, my aunt's sister, had been sick, too sick to travel. So it was my aunt who went up there to check on her, thinking, or maybe hoping, that it would be something simple. A broken phone line, a lost letter, something explainable. The mountains were coated in winter. And as my aunt drove, she kept telling herself that everything would be fine, because that's what you do when the alternative is unthinkable. Then, almost by accident, she saw a single sneaker lying at the side of the road. She wouldn't even have noticed it if the light hadn't hit it just right, if something inside her hadn't told her to slow down. But she did slow, and then she stopped. On both sides of the road there were only trees. Dark, quiet, endless trees. And that sneaker, sitting there in the snow like it had been placed rather than dropped. She recognized it. She had seen my cousin wearing them not long before. And that certainty, that sickening familiarity, froze her where she sat. She thought about getting out, about picking it up and keeping it as proof. But the forest felt wrong. It felt like something was there, watching her. So instead, fear made the decision for her. She stayed in the car, started it again, and continued toward the cabin. When she reached the cabin, the first thing she noticed was the door. It wasn't fully open. It wasn't fully closed either. It just hung there, slightly ajar, moving a little with the winter wind. Inside, it looked like life had been interrupted. There was nothing overturned, no obvious struggle, just wrongness. The floor was wet in patches, as if someone had walked through the cabin with snow-covered boots and let the melted water soak wherever it fell. Even the couch was damp, like someone had stood or jumped on it, boots and all. And all of it made no sense. She called out her niece's name again and again, but nothing answered. Just the sound of the wind against the walls and the deep quiet of winter pressing in. And instead of calling the police that night, which she would regret for the rest of her life, she decided to search. She walked the perimeter. She called into the trees. She told herself that her niece might be out there somewhere and might answer back. And so she searched until the cold drove her inside again. That night, she stayed in the cabin. She would later say that she felt watched almost immediately, that as soon as the dark settled against the windows, she started to feel that the woods weren't empty at all. And when she finally fell asleep upstairs, it was the kind of sleep that happens only after exhaustion and fear have worn you down to nothing. And then sometime in the middle of the night, she woke up. No sound had woken her, or maybe something had, but she could never describe it. Only that she woke with her heart racing, as though her body already knew what her eyes were about to see. At first, she says she was almost certain her niece was there, surprised to find her asleep in her bed. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized the room was completely empty. She went to the window and looked out across the snow and the trees. And there, moving slowly through the forest, was a figure. At first she thought, or desperately hoped, that it was her niece. She told herself that maybe the girl had been lost. Maybe she was frightened. Maybe she was disoriented. In that moment of confusion and fear, she did something that most people would later say was a mistake. But the truth is, we can all have our opinions, yet none of us were there to know how we would really react in a moment of such desperation and hope. So my aunt went running downstairs. She opened the cabin door. And when she looked again, really looked, she saw that it wasn't her niece at all. It was a man. A man walking calmly through the trees in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. At first, he didn't see her. He just kept walking like he knew exactly where he was going. Then, out of nowhere, he looked straight at my aunt. The moment he saw her, he started running toward the door. My aunt, terrified, slammed it shut immediately. Terror hit her all at once. She locked every lock. She checked every window. And then she spent the rest of the night sitting awake, listening to the quiet, certain that she had made a terrible mistake by not calling the police sooner, thinking that she had narrowly avoided something happening to her as well. And the more she thought about it, the more a deep sadness settled over her. The certainty that this man had been responsible for her niece's disappearance. By the time the sky finally began to lighten, she had already decided. She wasn't waiting anymore. The police arrived faster than she expected. They searched the cabin. They searched the surrounding woods. But winter complicates everything. Snow hides and snow erases. There were almost no clear tracks left, no signs that led anywhere, no certainty. And slowly, the search widened. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And then, finally, into years. My cousin was never found. No body, no lost clothing, and no answers, just absence. And one thing my aunt always mentions is that just one day earlier, that sneaker was right there by the side of the road. But the police never found it. My aunt went back to the spot several times, but it was gone. Which means someone must have deliberately removed it. And the family, especially my aunt and her sisters, broke in ways that can't really be repaired. Grief like that isn't loud, it's quiet. It moves into a house and stays there. And now, more than 45 years later, my mother told me the whole story again because for a moment, like I mentioned at the beginning, there was news. Someone had found a woman in Canada who looked remarkably like my cousin would look today. And hope came back. But it wasn't her. And so the story sits where it always has. In winter. In the Appalachians. In the space between what we know and what we fear. And all I can really say is that the mountains never answered us back. They just kept the silence we gave them. And that's why I'm telling it now. Not to solve anything. Not to reopen the wound. But simply because, after all these years, the story still lives here. And sometimes, when the cold wind blows through the trees just right, it feels like the past is still out there, walking slowly between the shadows.